Looks like we're up and live on YouTube. Facebook should be up shortly here. Hopefully, any second now it finishes loading. As usual, it's going as slow as ever. All right, there we go. Looks like we are live on Facebook. Welcome in everyone so far. There's nobody watching yet, but that's par for the course. We'll give it some time till people come on in. My name is Connor Riley. I'm here with Dog Nation. So usual Tuesday night chats. Doing a little early tonight. I have an errand to go run shortly after this, but I wanted to give you guys plenty of time to give you updates on the latest news. There's certainly been a lot of it in the past week, and even more coming out today. And I think even tomorrow and Thursday, you're going to see more news on the schedule front as well for Georgia. Been a busy weekend, and want to give you guys time to ask questions, answer comments, sort of everything in between. I know the Georgia Tech issue is something I've talked a lot about recently, and I'm sure there are plenty of things that you guys have questions about and whatnot. So we'll give everyone a few minutes before sort of diving in to our first big topic tonight and discussing really the big news of the day with the SEC announcing the start of its fall practice schedule and what that sort of means for Georgia going forward. So we'll discuss that. Dustin Chase Hester, good to see you. Alan Rabanchich, good to see you. Yeah, make sure you have your mask. The governor of Mississippi today came out and said that they were going to have a mask mandate because he wants to see football in the fall. Maybe not the words I would use, but that's I think the thing we're looking at right now is you're seeing some of these governors in some of these states sort of realize the gravity of the situation, and if we don't get this disease better under control, especially by the September 26th start date, we might not have college football, or at least it might be pushed back even further than from when it already is. So I think it's sort of important to keep that stuff in mind and continue to practice that and go out there. So we'll give it about another minute or two before things get in. Yeah, JC Cole, they're pushing back the dates, and I think the big thing with the SEC pushing it back is because they want to see how students being reintroduced into the equation sort of affects, players potentially testing positive, how that impacts the team, because it's pretty clear in the South they're going to try, and in southern SEC states, going to try and have kids back on college campuses. And if that introduced just a whole new wrinkle of positive case, it's hard to start the season on September 5th, September 7th. So I think, they made a very smart move, in my opinion, by pushing it back to September 26th, sort of seeing how students being reintegrated does, seeing how the NFL does with theoretically them starting their season. I believe the ACC and the Big 12 are also starting earlier as well. So it'll be interesting to sort of see where and how that goes. And, we can also always at the end of the night talk a little recruiting. Georgia did gain a recommitment of sorts last night with Jared Wilson. So, some recruiting news, and Jeff Sentell will have more on that tomorrow with his show. Before the Hedges, make sure to tune in that. Last night on the Beat, Mike Griffith had Bill Hancock, the executive director of the College Football Playoff Committee, sort of let you know what kind of plans the College Football Playoff Committee has and is making. Now all Power 5 conferences are essentially, with the exception of the Big 12 and ACC, going to Power 5 or conference only schedules. So we'll sort of see how that goes from there. So welcome in, everybody. Hope everything's doing well. Hope everything's going on in your neck of the woods. So without further ado, let's get into the biggest news of the day. The SEC announced that they would be pushing back the start of spring practice to August 17th. For most teams, they were set to begin August 7th. And essentially, the NCAA has said if you want to start practicing then, you can. But as a conference, the SEC decided to move that date back. It is still 40 days to get in 25 practices as opposed to 29 days to get in. I'm not sure the number of practices, but it's certainly less than 25 practices before the start of the season. So Georgia will not totally make up the practices that they lost for spring practice, but they will make up some of those. And most importantly, I think that means that the Georgia offense is going to get more reps, more practice time to figure out who's going to become that starting quarterback for that first game on September 26th. Now, right now, we don't know who Georgia's first opponent is on September 26th. The SEC has not announced that schedule yet, though I expect that to be announced very shortly in the coming days, possibly as early as even tomorrow. That is something that is on my radar. You've seen both, adding the next 2 teams in rotation as a possible schedule matter, or possibly bringing in strength of schedule and how that might impact it. I think either way, there's a weirdly good chance that Georgia ends up playing both Arkansas and Mississippi State, because if they go to the next 2 rotations for their SEC West crossover opponents, that means that Georgia will play Arkansas and Mississippi State. If they go based on a strength of schedule matter, Georgia plays Alabama and Auburn already, and those are, I believe, the second and third best teams in the SEC West a year ago. So to sort of counterbalance that and those strong records, you're probably going to see teams like Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Arkansas, if I had to guess, on their schedule. Now, what I think is important with all this is particularly what it would mean for Florida, because Georgia and Florida are both competing for, the SEC. They're 2 pretty big favorites, and I think with that, Florida, if they get the next 2 opponents on their SEC West rotation, they get Texas A&M and they get Alabama, and that I think drastically swings their schedule from being pretty easy to being fairly difficult. So they're a team that if they do go the strength of schedule route, which I do sort of think they might, I think that's ultimately, a team that stands to benefit quite a lot from the schedule. But I think either way, Georgia's next 2 potential opponents, the SEC West opponents they get, when you're already playing Alabama and Auburn, those are probably going to be the 2 best teams in the SEC West this year. Maybe Texas A&M, maybe LSU, if you want to make that argument. But Georgia, I think whoever they get there will be fine. Colby Curry on YouTube asked what we're talking about. So today, the SEC announced that they are moving back the start of spring practices, or not spring practices. They are moving back the start of fall practice to August 17th. And essentially what that means going forward is starting on August 17th, here, you have 20-hour practice weeks, which is essentially what it would be when school is in session. And I believe school at Georgia starts August 20th. For Georgia, the start of practice is essentially moved back 8 days. They do lose 8 days theoretically, but I think one of the things you worry about with the pushback start date is sort of overworking these guys and the potential of burnout. And I think the coaches were going to have to try and find interesting ways to sort of manage and balance how they got the most out of the players over, I guess, what would have been almost a 50-day run from that first possible practice date to that September 26th start date. So, spacing it out a little bit more, having to have 2 off days a week, a somewhat more normal practice schedule. I do think that's going to help the guys, keep them a little bit more fresh, keep them feeling better. And with Georgia in particular, more so than any other team, with all the turnover on offense, they are still, I think, with the pushback September 26th start date, I think that's going to do a lot for them in terms of figuring out and seeing, at least in a practice setting, who the best possible quarterback is for what Todd Monken and his offense wants to do. So, Hugh Nash, welcome in. Good to see you. So, these extra practices, if it were, the regular year I don't say we'd gotten rid of COVID, but we had managed it and things were starting on time like they would have been. And you had the August 9th start date and the September 7th first game. You do have a little bit less time there and obviously fewer practices to figure out what you have in Jamie Newman, Dwan Mathis, Carson Beck, JT Daniels, Stetson Bennett, what you have in what is a very crowded quarterback room. And so with that in mind, these extra practices are going to, I think, end up helping Georgia quite a bit in terms of at least solving or seeing what they have in both those quarterbacks, because it wouldn't surprise me if Georgia at some point this season, just given what COVID is and how we've clearly seen it's going to impact the college football season, it's not the worst thing in the world that Georgia has 2 very capable quarterbacks who have started 10-plus games in JT Daniels and Jamie Newman, and even a guy like Dwan Mathis and Carson Beck as well. And from what I've heard, Dwan Mathis has looked really good this summer, really good in the workouts. So, again, the more reps for these guys, the more practices, I think it's a good thing, especially for this Georgia quarterback room, because more than anything else, it does give them more time. And that's, I think, just the biggest thing: time, repetitions, experience, learning and the know-how in the Georgia offense. Now, starting on Friday, it does get a little bit more condensed, going away from the summer access with walkthroughs practices. They won't be able to use a football going through those sort of practices in the next week. But ultimately, I think, it makes sense to push back the start of spring practice a little bit, get everyone on a uniform starting date, and sort of, make everything at least a little bit fair, or fair, maybe not the right word, given it's college football and nothing about it is fair. The comments right now, Oliver Bonchin's bringing up James Crump with the Wu-Tang reference. This season is all about the money, and really, everything I believe in life is about money. So with that in mind, that's sort of where it is. Sean Thomas asks, can they practice on the weekends before the game weekends? That'd probably be smart to keep the guys from going out. So the only practice stipulations are that you have to have 2 days off in a week. So, you could choose for those days to be, say, like a Thursday and a Sunday. I'm almost positive they're going to have one of those practice days off. But, in August in the past, they've had practices on Saturdays going up to the first game of the season. One, because I think you just want to get your body ready for practicing on those on Saturdays, and sort of, a lot of times they have those scrimmages, those fall scrimmages on Saturdays. And I think that's a way to sort of prepare yourself, have yourself thinking Saturday is the most important day of the week. So that's what I think you're going to see from a scheduling standpoint. Glenn Rubin asks, what are they allowed to do now? Can they walk through without pads? Do they have playbooks yet? They've had playbooks for a very long time. There has been nothing to sort of stop them from the playbooks. Up until Friday, they can sort of have walkthroughs without pads, without helmets, but with a football. So essentially, they can actually install play, see how it looks, see how it goes, and, run it a little bit, but not have anything too serious or too strenuous. And they've been able to do that for about 2 weeks now. From Friday, August 7th through August 16th, there will not be a football allowed in walkthrough practices. That just goes away for the weeks. That's just the decision that the SEC had made. And probably part of that is to give a break between this, pretty clear ramp-up schedule and the start of fall practice. They do, I think, want to space things out and give these guys a little bit of a break. So that's sort of, I think, the big difference. There is also, in that essentially 1 week, they go from having 20 available practice hours to 14 hours. So it's a little bit less of, work in that 1 week, really. But other than that, it's nothing too significant of a change, other than I think the not having the football would be the biggest change in that 1 week before when practice starts. Jay Shibbles, it'd be the walkthrough practice. Think of a lot of it as like flag football. You're not doing a whole lot. So, and Kenneth Wiggins, delaying the new offense, I think, or not delaying the new offense, delaying the start of the season, I think, is a big benefit for this Georgia offense, just because it gives them more time to work things out. It gives them more time in practice to see things, to understand concepts. For Todd Monken to get a sort of longer look at whoever that quarterback is going to be. And it's not just the quarterback. You look, and one of the things I talked about today with BA on Dog Nation Daily, you look at that wide receiver room. September 26th start date is beneficial for Dominic Blaylock. It gives him more time to sort of get comfortable with his knee, go through practices. Those extra practices, I think, are going to help him get ready for whenever Georgia's first game is. And it wouldn't surprise me to see Georgia's first game of the season be against Alabama, given that game needs to be rescheduled, and Georgia does have September 26th open on the schedule. So you look at him there. You look at some of the freshmen, specifically Marcus Rosemy and Jermaine Burton. Those are guys who, one, weren't going to get a chance to go through, those spring practices in the spring, and now they sort of do get an extended runway to sort of get up to speed, become a little bit better, get ready to go for the upcoming season. And what we saw last year with George Pickens, and I'll probably have something on this later this week on just freshman receivers, guys who ranked among the top 100 overall prospects, elite sort of wide receiver prospects, sort of what they've done over the course of the season. And this is just, I think, speaking anecdotally here, you look at guys like Justin Ross at Clemson and George Pickens, guys we think had great, very big freshman seasons. Those guys really didn't start contributing and putting up the really big numbers until the end of the season, specifically with Ross and Pickens. The extra bowl practices that they had for Pickens last year in the Sugar Bowl and Ross for the college football playoff, once they got those under the belt and they got a little bit more accustomed to the college game, that helped them a lot. So I think that for those two guys in particular, and not just him, but all the freshmen, guys like Jalen Carter, Darnell Washington, this extra practice time, I do think is going to be a big benefit to getting freshmen on the field early. And when you are bringing in the best freshman class in the country, which Georgia is, that's, I think, another benefit to a delayed start of the season. Now, Connor, when do you think Saban will give final schedule approval? I again, this is speculating here a little bit. It wouldn't surprise me if it came out tomorrow. Certainly, I would think by the end of the week. I don't know if they're going to have the official dates just yet, but I believe that they'll have the 2 additional opponents announced. Keith Foles, that's my computer. I'm getting a couple of text messages. One thing Mike D brings up today. Go check out Jeff Santel's story on Brock Vandagriff and Amarius Mims, their sort of relationship. It's been something that's very interesting to me to sort of watch from a distance and see how involved Vandagriff has been in recruiting Mims. They're coming from different parts of the state. Vandagriff is right there in Bogart, Georgia, right around Athens, whereas Mims a little bit further south. So I think with that, I think, I would just encourage you to all go check that out, read it. It was a really great read today. And Mims, he's been moving his commitment date around. Personally speaking, I'd be surprised if Georgia doesn't end up getting Mims in the end. He's set to announce, I believe, October 14th now. It's his birthday. I would expect that to be a very good day for Georgia fans of Georgia recruiting. I know there's been a little bit of concern on what recruiting is for Georgia, especially in the pandemic. They did get a commitment yesterday in Jared Wilson, a recommitment of sorts. I believe they bring in Mims there. That will, I think, really help sort of shore up the offensive line and sort of close the book, so to speak, on the offensive line class when you have a guy like Wilson, Dylan Fairchild, Micah Morris, and then Mims on top of that. It's a very strong and I think very good offensive line class there. Brock Bowers, he was somebody who tweeted out, I guess, technically late Sunday night Pacific time, early Monday a.m. Eastern Standard Time. He's getting close to a decision. That looks down to be between Georgia and Washington, literally 2 of the farthest schools away in terms of distance. So I think with that, my friends are just the worst. I'm sorry, guys. So sorry about that. With Bowers, again, I think it's significant that a guy like him is on his own dime flying across the country to just sort of take a look at and see the campus and check out and see how things are going. That's not an easy trip. And for him, I think to go to that distance, I think said a lot about his interest in Georgia and how much Georgia is interested in him. With the guys Georgia signed at tight end in the past, they're typically bigger body guys, 6'6", 6'5", 6'7". Brock Bowers is not quite that big, but he's, I think, probably the most athletic guy Georgia would have signed at that tight end position. So I think if that's the direction that they're willing to go moving forward, I think that's a very good thing. Again, yeah, it's a group. First of all, it's a group chat, but it is what it is. So, any questions you guys have, I'm more than willing to answer them. We'll probably go, I'd say maybe another 10 minutes tonight. Again, hopefully my phone stops dinging. It looks like it has. So that's good news there. Let's see. Other things. What did I even? Yeah. Darnell Washington, we mentioned him a little bit earlier as one of the guys who I think can really benefit because you will get to see, at least the Georgia coaches will anyway, none of us will. They'll get to see sort of how Georgia looks and how Darnell Washington sort of looks in an extended practice run, those extra practices, and I believe it would get to 25. Georgia would have 25 practices before that first game. Those extra practices, I think, are really going to help those freshmen and those young guys. So Christopher White asked, when is the schedule expected to be announced? I imagine probably this week you'll find out who those 2 additional opponents will be. And after that, maybe another 2 or 3 weeks, maybe right around the start of September for when that first game is now. Because I think the big thing and the reason the schedule hasn't been announced yet is, money, television money. I think the TV networks are trying to get all this set up and have, especially those early first couple of games, set up and locked in and ready to go, but also potential contingency plans if those games do end up getting postponed. I think one thing to look at with regards to the schedule is I would encourage you all to go look up, and I wrote about this yesterday, sort of what the Pac-12 model is doing, because it is essentially similar to, I think, what the SEC is trying to do. They will each play 10-game conference-only schedules. They will both be starting on September 26th. And from there, the Pac-12, they have 2 bye weeks. They have a bye week at the midpoint of the season, sort of over a 2-3 week stretch, and then they have a bye week on December 12th. The SEC will follow that sort of similar model of a bye week in the middle of October, and then you have that December 12th open date, and that December 12th open date is essentially functioning as if we need to postpone games, especially in the second half of the season, those are when the games will be postponed to. So that's sort of, I think, a model. It's something to look at there for Georgia's potential schedule and what it might look like this year. It will have 2 bye weeks. It will have 10 opponents. It has the 8 original SEC opponents from this year. So Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, Missouri, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and then the 2 additional SEC West programs, which we do not yet know in it. So does Kirby have any control in putting off Alabama later in the season? I don't think so. It's pretty interesting, I think, the dynamic we've seen between when should Georgia want to play Alabama. There's been, some out there that are okay delaying, I think as John brings up, delaying the start of that Alabama game to sort of get more confidence and see what you have in the offense. And then Brandon Adams has made this argument that potentially playing them early in the season, I think maybe does give Georgia a little bit of an advantage in the sense that Alabama doesn't know what to prepare for really with this new look Georgia offense. So I think that'd be very interesting to sort of see when that game is played and how it affects the Georgia offense. Knowing all luck, it'll probably be like right in the middle of the 5th or 6th game of the season. But I think it's interesting to see sort of the fan discussion of when they want that game played. Sean Thomas, do we think there will be an 18 playoff? I don't. Bill Hancock has continued to say that it's going to be a 14 playoff for right now. I know there's been some discussion. Well, how do you determine this if, non-conference play isn't all that involved or isn't all that big? Speaking truthfully here, I don't think non-conference play plays a huge factor in determining how great someone is. I do, Oregon last year does come to mind as a team that, if they had just not played Auburn and they'd played a more cupcake team and went 11-1, there's probably a pretty good chance and an argument to be made that they should have belonged in the playoff. And yes, you do lose those games, and not having those games is, I think, one less data point to have. But I personally believe, this stuff's all going to work itself out over the course of the season. I do think having conference only games and not sort of having those points of comparison, it is going to make the eye test and specifically looking really good when you win games all the more important. You look back last year at Georgia, if they were winning the games that they were winning in the fashion that they were, aka very ugly, close games where Georgia just really didn't look all that much better than any opponent that they played, even though they did end up winning a lot of those games, I think that would really hurt them in a potential college football playoff discussion, much like it did a year ago, but even more so this year because it won't have that Notre Dame win to sort of rely on. So Jermaine Dunbar asked, do I think will Georgia air it out against Alabama? I don't. I think there's still going to be a team that runs the ball first, that wants to run the football. As long as Kirby Smart is here and the head coach at Georgia, I believe that the offense will be run first because until I see differently, I believe that is what Kirby Smart wants to do. And that is how Kirby Smart wants to win football games. He wants to sort of wear teams down over the course of 4 quarters, and because ultimately that's how you win a lot of games, especially when you have such a talent advantage like Georgia does. I saw Jacob O'Neal chime in and say he wants to play Bama first. I think you're going to see Bama twice this season. I think you're going to see him at the end of the year in the ACC championship game, which has now been pushed back to December 19th. That will still be played in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I think you're going to see them twice. You're going to see them, obviously, at some point on Georgia's schedule, whether that's now in the beginning, middle, or end. But I think in that SEC championship game, that is when you see them. I think those are, in my opinion, pretty clearly the 2 best teams, and I don't think whoever gets added to their schedules is really going to impact it all that much. And, Georgia might be 8-2 going into that game instead of 11-1, or Alabama might be that, and Georgia might be 9-1, or vice versa. But I will be interested to see at the end of the year if Georgia and Bama, if it's 10-0 versus 9-1. I do personally feel like the argument of why the SEC going forward shouldn't go to more conference games, the air does sort of get let out of the balloon a little bit, because the argument is, well, you have all these great SEC teams beating up on each other, and that obviously would potentially hurt their college football playoff arguments. But if you see teams like Georgia, I think will, like Alabama, I think will, like potentially Florida could, not necessarily have an easy time, but get through the schedule and get 10-0, 9-1, a very good 8-2. I don't expect them to go to 10 games anytime soon. But I do think the argument to having a ninth conference game and taking off, say, an East Tennessee State or Louisiana Monroe every year, I do think that argument is sort of significantly damaged if this season, assuming it goes off without a hitch, is sort of boosted by a good-looking 10-game SEC champion. Let's see. Questions, comments. We'll go probably the good old BA, another 5 good minutes. Enrique Murillo, welcome in. Let's see. Yeah, Keith Folds, I think, on speaking on the offense, I think hits the nail on the head. Georgia is still going to be run first, but they have to be willing and they have to be able, I think, to hit those big passing plays. And last year, for a variety of different reasons, the wide receivers, I think Jake Fromm regressing a little bit. I think the offensive play calling, they were just not able to do that. And because of that, I think that just crowds the line of scrimmage more, and it makes things a little bit more difficult for the running backs, for the offensive line to do what they need to do. Mitchell Whitehead asked, does the possibility of shuffling our schedule affect playing in Jacksonville since it's a neutral site game? No. The Georgia-Florida game this year, unless something changes, which is the direct quote from Greg McGarity, will still be played in Jacksonville this year. I know Mike Griffith, that's one of his pound-the-table arguments, that game needs to be moved out of Jacksonville. I disagree, but that game as constituted, and the reason for that is going to remain in Jacksonville this year. Let's say, all right, you want to turn that into a Georgia home game this year because Georgia's the home team. Well, there's at best going to be a limited capacity crowd. I believe between 18 and 30,000 fans is what Georgia is projecting at the moment. Let's say a year from now, when we've gotten past COVID and we've beaten it and we've got a vaccine and everything's great again, Georgia's going to have to go down to Florida, and you don't want to go there and play in front of 93,000 fans because you made, I think, a short-sighted decision to play in front of a mostly empty stadium the year before. So I think that's the reasoning and the logic for right now keeping it through in Jacksonville through 2023. Though, personally speaking, as someone who very much would love to see that game continue to stay in Jacksonville, I don't know how much longer that's going to be the case. I think the writing there is pretty much on the wall with where that is, where the future of that game is going. Let's see. Questions. Yeah, Zentry Allen, I want to stay a run-first offense. We just need more deep shots, better route designs for wide receivers. We have to do a better job scheming the wide receivers open. And Zenti, excuse me, I think that the way you describe that describes what Todd Monken has done in the past. He's been a vertical passing offense. I know some have said air raid. He's a guy, you look at what he's been able to get out of wide receivers. Mike Evans had his best years in the NFL when he was there. He had Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, even though, Cleveland struggled quite a bit last year, go over 1,000 yards receiving. You look at Justin Blackmon in his time back at Oklahoma State, winning the Biletnikoff Award. I do think that the wide receivers, by virtue of, one, just being a little bit older, obviously a lot more talented with Pickens and Blaylock coming back, with the freshmen that they brought in, I do think wide receiver, while it is still a worry at this point in the year, I don't think it will become the end of the season. And more importantly, going forward, it's to me less of a concern than it so obviously was a season ago. What happens if the SEC champ, and this is a good, I don't love getting into hypotheticals because we could spend all day doing it, but this is a good one from Sean. What happens if the SEC championship game, both teams are undefeated? Would a one-loss Big Ten champ or other lower conference get in over the other one-loss SEC team? Sean, I will tell you one, I don't think a one-loss Big Ten champ is going to happen. I think Ohio State is just so far ahead of every other Big Ten team. But, a one-loss Pac-12 team, for example, if it's Georgia and Alabama, they're both not going to be undefeated because they are both playing each other. But it's Georgia, LSU, they're both undefeated. I think that is an example where the eye test and how well you have played are really, really going to be scrutinized because one of the big things, again, you don't have those sort of cross-conference comparisons here. So, a 9-1 Oregon versus, say, a 9-1 or a 10-1 LSU versus a 10-1 Oregon, who would get in there? I think really, as fair or unfair as it might be, however close or well played LSU plays, I think in that SEC championship game, if they go toe to toe with Georgia, and they had been a pretty clearly 2 or 3 team over the course of the year, and Oregon had been a little bit farther back because they weren't quite as impressive, I do think LSU would probably end up getting in that situation. But if it's just pure on paper and everything is created equal, I do think there's probably a fairly good chance that a conference with a lesser team, or a team that we don't perceive to be quite as good, would get in over a one-loss SEC championship runner-up. Noah Sullivan, he says LSU isn't making the playoff again. No one was saying LSU was making the playoff last year before the season, and they blew everyone out of the way. So I wouldn't be totally surprised to see LSU. Ed Orgeron is a really good coach. They've still got a lot of talent. Jamar Chase, and it might be one of the best players in all of college football. So it wouldn't stun me to see LSU, maybe not to the same level that they did a season ago, but still be a very good and possible college football playoff contender. Don Williams brings up multiple 1,000-yard receivers he would hope. Georgia's only had one 1,000-yard receiver in their entire program history, and that's Terrence Edwards back in 2002. But if Georgia could get one this year, I think that'd be very huge. So let's see. Yeah, let's get one last good question, one last great question before calling it a night. We've gone about half an hour. You guys, as always, have been great again. Hope you guys are staying safe, wearing a mask, enjoying life to the best that you can, and sort of keeping things as copacetic as you really can right now. Let's see. One last great question. All right, Brian Kephart, what specifically do you feel Monken brings that we haven't had on the coaching staff? This is going to sound a little bit like BA, but I think the thing that he brings is a very clear, authoritative, outside voice that I think doesn't have an issue of saying, hey, Kirby, we're not doing that. As much as James Coley brought to the program, it's clear that I believe Kirby promoted him and kept him on because, not that he was a yes man, so to speak, but because of just the familiarity, the similarities that they had had before. And it's clear now that Georgia, that's not good enough to win at Georgia. That's not good enough to win. I mean, Georgia won a lot of games last year with James Coley, but it clearly wasn't going to win them the games that they need to win from a national standpoint to get to a national title. So I think the biggest thing, it's not a concept. It's not a talent or an ability. It's, I think, his forcefulness in his voice to have the ability to challenge Kirby Smart, to be an outside voice and outside of the traditional Kirby Smart tree, to sort of challenge that and say, hey, this is the way things should be done. And he does have some credibility there. That Oklahoma State team in 2011, while Mike Gundy, I believe, was calling plays, I do think that he does have a lot more credibility in that aspect than I think James Coley did, even though James Coley had clearly spent much more time on the Georgia staff than Monken had. So, again, if Monken has a Joe Brady-like impact this year, and believe me, if he does, I will never hear the end of it from BA, that'll be, I think, really great and really good things for Georgia. So, really good question there, Brian. So, we'll call it a night for that. Thanks again for tuning in, guys. We try to be back every Tuesday that we can. Check out Before the Hedges tomorrow with Jeff Santel. He'll have more recruiting. I imagine he'll be chatting with Jared Wilson, Georgia's newest commit, a recommitment of sorts. We have Cover 4 Live on Thursday. I think that was a ton of fun last week with all the news. Mike Griffith and Brandon Adams really got into it. I know I'm someone who's been known to get into it and get aggressive in those types of discussions. It was really fun to be a part of that. I would encourage you guys to check that out. Friday night, you have Mike Griffith, and then you have him on Mondays with On the Beat. Check those out. Obviously, every Monday through Friday, you're getting your meat and potatoes with Brandon Adams on Dog Nation Daily. So we have got a ton of stuff coming for you. Football, while it's been pushed back and delayed a little bit, it's closer than ever. We're less than 2 weeks away from the start of fall camp. So all in all, we're getting closer and closer to a start. I do think we're going to see it. Whether we get through that depends on a lot of external factors, but I'm looking forward to seeing how all this turns out. One last thing before I go. BA has mentioned this. If you're interested, on our site, we are doing a sort of special limited availability where you can Zoom in with Brandon Adams and Mike Griffiths. It's Inside the Huddle. You sort of get inside access to things going on in the Georgia program, what we're hearing, stuff that doesn't even make it on these sorts of broadcasts that we usually chat with Beyond Cover for, sort of really inside information. You'll get to ask questions directly in person to Mike and Brandon. I think it's going to be a great thing. Availability is limited, but if enough people sign up, we're going to try and do a second one. Inside the Huddle, check it out on the Dog Nation site. I would definitely encourage you to look into that if that's something you're interested in and knowing, certainly learning more about the Georgia football program this year. Yeah, Keith Foltz has his ticket. Fantastic, Keith. So that's going to do it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in as always, guys. Have a great Tuesday night and have a great rest of the week.